All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the We Never Stopped Women and Political Participation in Tennessee presentation. Uh, Welcome. And my name is Dresca Nunez Medina. I'm with the Tennessee State Museum and I'm in community engagement. Thanks for joining us. And we are lucky today to have Amanda Lee Savage for our Native American History Month programming. We are going to have two events, one today and one next week at the same time, that are going to commemorate Native American History Month and all of our natives here or from Tennessee. So again, today we have Amanda Lee Savage, and she's an instructor of history at the University of Memphis, and she specializes in early U.S. and Native history. She will be talking to us about the political participation of women within the state, with a focus on Native women in politics. We're very excited to have you. Thank you so much for joining us, and you're free to take it away.
All right, thank you so much. So I am going to, if you could bear with me for a moment while I do the now usual sorting, share my screen. And then wait, start. Okay. So thank you again. I just want to say how to be speaking with you this evening, and to everybody at the Tennessee State Museum who made this happen. It's really nice to be back. I was able to speak there a few years ago, and it was snowing on my way down and it snowed on my way back, but I have to say the pandemic is worse. I would absolutely take the snow over the global pandemic. But thank you to everyone also who's doing their part to slow COVID-19, including the museum for offering online events to still commemorate Native American Heritage Month, which is important. And to the people joining from home, because then you let us know that these are viable ways to still do outreach with our communities, and that's really important for us. So happy Native American Heritage Month. For the record, I am not Native American. I am Native Hawaiian and Hapahaoli, which is to say that I'm both Native Hawaiian and part white. But I do study Indigenous peoples and I study colonization. And more importantly to me right now, I am looking at other ways to practice decolonization, whether that's in the university where I work, at academia more generally, or in my city, just kind of more broadly. And so I think that that's Indigenous peoples, studying the U.S.'s relationship with Indigenous peoples is fundamental to thinking about the ways that we can start practicing decolonization in our own spaces. And so in addition to celebrating Native American Heritage Month, this is the celebration of the 19th Amendment. And so my talk tonight really hopes to get into the intersection of these things: Native Americans, their heritages and traditions, women's political engagement and what forms that took in the past, and then what that might mean now for the present. Oops. All right. I did want to do a land acknowledgement before we got started. This is a land acknowledgement for Memphis, Tennessee, because that's the land that I'm sitting on right now, that I am coming to you from. I know that if you are in other parts of Tennessee or in other places, you might want to take this moment to acknowledge the land that you're sitting on. But I'm beginning today by recognizing and acknowledging that I am on the historic homeland of the Chickasaw Nation. I have a cat. Of which they inhabited. Memphis and all of Tennessee was the long-established territory for many Indigenous peoples prior to their forced removal and unforeseen extinction. And we have a responsibility to acknowledge the peoples and the histories of these lands. Our ability to live here is the result of direct coercion, forced dispossession, and deliberate colonization. To ignore that is to perpetuate injustice to populations of people that no longer exist in this state, yet have established major societies elsewhere in the country. The city of Memphis respects the diverse communities it touches, including those who occupied this territory originally, those brought to it by force, and those who settled here in search of better circumstances. We understand that territorial acknowledgement is only a gesture, but it represents the beginning of our commitment to justice and reconciliation in the United States. And as always, I want to thank the Chickasaw Nation for helping us write that acknowledgement for our city. We are thankful. I want to start too by talking about the map I've used in this slide. The colors are incredibly beautiful. That's not why I used it, but it's worth pointing out. And I think the layering here is interesting. I'll post the website in the chat when the talk is over because I wasn't sure how to share a website through the presentation. But the website allows you to zoom in on any place on the globe and see what indigenous populations lived there and occupied that territory before the United States or whatever country you're looking at came to occupy that territory. And so it informs us if we didn't know before, or it reminds us if we know, but Native sovereignty is something we sort of let sit in the back of our mind, that this country as it exists now exists on land that it took from other people, people who occupied it, who used it, who lived on it, who called it home, who raised their families here, and who wanted to continue to do so prior to their forced removal. And many of those people still exist. I think it's really the things I try to talk about during Native heritage presentations is that we talk about Native peoples in the present tense as well. So it is really important to exist that the peoples who lived here do still exist. Many of them are living and thriving on other land, but many of them still do feel a connection to their historical homelands. Okay, the second map that I wanted to use to talk for a moment is this one. And this is a map of, the modern United States as it stands right now, but with indigenous territory, Native American territory sort of outlined and marked in alternate colors. And these are the territories the U.S. recognizes as belonging to Native Americans. And I realize that there are lots of issues in my sentence already, that the United States gets the authority to recognize or not Native Americans is a power dynamic that we could absolutely explore later or at another time. But fact of the matter is, and the reason I pulled this map up now is because we often talk about the United States and use maps of the United States that completely erase or do not acknowledge the territory that belongs to indigenous people, that is their sovereign territory. Those territories have a relationship with our federal government, but not with our state government. And to continue to do so is an erasure of indigenous peoples in our history. And so I bring this map to your attention. I have started to use it in all of my own talks because, to be honest, it wasn't until last year that it occurred to me I ought to be changing the ways that I present and talk about Native Americans and the images I use. So these things are always like an ongoing practice. Decolonization is an ongoing practice, and usually we can find little ways to sort of tweak what we're doing to make it better, but we're always working on it. And so, when we talk about the United States, we should use maps that clearly indicate the boundaries of the land belonging to sovereign nations. We should stop telling overgeneralizations that are actually fictions. But the reason I brought these two maps up is because tonight I'm sort of asking us to reconsider our understanding of land, of boundaries, and of belonging. I'm going to tell a place-based story tonight. And so the place is going to stay the same, right? We're looking at the state that is now Tennessee. That was not Tennessee prior to 1795. I think that was the year, and is now Tennessee. So the geographic region is going to stay the same, but the peoples we're talking about and sort of who controls that state and who decides what women can and can't do shifts over the timeline of that story. So the place stays the same, even if the rules change. And that's not the only thing we're going to be reconsidering tonight. We're also going to be discussing women, political power, and political engagement. Many women, or many people, men and women, but especially women, fought to change the Constitution in such a way that women were not prohibited from voting. And so, all right. So Tennessee did become the last to ratify the 19th Amendment. And unless that sounds like a critique somehow, many states outright rejected the 19th Amendment. And so it's an awesome thing that Tennessee decided to ratify it. And in becoming the last state to choose to do so, it was able to become an amendment to the Constitution. But I want to be clear that the 19th Amendment doesn't grant women the right to vote. I think this language of give and grant and gain is nice and it's warm fuzzy, and it makes it sound like the United States is always moving forward. And we often use those terms when we're discussing constitutional amendments that were designed to make the political experiment that is the United States of America less classist, less racist, and less sexist. But at the end of the day, what this amendment does is it just prevents the United States from continuing to discriminate on the basis of sex. Acknowledging this does not make the 19th Amendment any less significant, right? Because voting matters in any democracy, and any elimination of barriers to the voting process is to be celebrated. But it would be misleading for us to assume or believe that women had no political voice until they were able to vote. Certainly voting is not the only way to participate in, shape, or engage with government. And women across North America, whether they were part of the European colonizers, whether they were enslaved or free Africans, or if they were Native Americans, engaged in political acts constantly. But how we define what constitutes political acts and those engagements is a big talk, probably for somebody more skilled in this. But I do want to be clear that voting is not the only way that women or men or anybody speaks and shapes and responds to their government. What I'm hoping to show you tonight is that in what was now the state of Tennessee, or now the state of the 124 years between statehood, when Tennessee became a state in the United States, and ratifying the 19th Amendment were actually a long and unusual period of time in this place. Women in this region had previously exercised a voice in tribal affairs, in their governments, in the running of their communities, and in their families. It is only with the arrival of European colonizers and then the creation of the United States and its expansion into this area that women who lived here in this space had their political rights diminished. The US brought with it its sexist restrictions on political engagement, and that included who could participate directly in governance and self-governance. And then, of course, it fixed it with the 19th Amendment. So tonight we're going to explore the roles of women in this region prior to US intervention, so prior to the 19th century. We're going to discuss how those women, or how those roles changed after the US expanded into Tennessee and why. And in doing so, I'm hoping to sort of illustrate that ratifying the 19th Amendment in Tennessee was a moment when the United States finally caught up with what the Chickasaw and the Cherokee had been doing already. And indeed, many Native Americans in North America had been doing since before the Europeans arrived on their shores. Women's suffrage wasn't exactly a novel idea, nor was it all that radical if we examine the entire context of North America and the peoples who were living in North America. So extending the timeline within which we view women in their political lives here, and what we now consider the US, fundamentally, I think, alters sort of the story of women's rights. And I promise you that this isn't just some weird idea that I've come up with by myself, that I have convinced everyone to let me share with you. Maybe some of it is, and if there are errors in here, those are all my own. But there is some evidence that the suffragists credited with the 19th Amendment were inspired by Six Nations and their observations of the gender roles among many Indigenous peoples. And so this sort of idea about the rights and liberties in the United States being influenced by what the colonizers who came over here saw among Indigenous peoples is prominent, even while at the same time colonizers were also trying to eliminate or exterminate Indigenous peoples. So let's see, sorry. One moment. All right, so I just wanted to use these maps. I really like maps, if you probably haven't been able to tell, just to kind of reiterate that prior to the United States becoming, or Tennessee becoming a state, that this land was populated with Indigenous peoples, and not just Chickasaw and the Cherokee, the two nations I've chosen to reference this evening, but a number of other Indigenous peoples. And even as late as 1791 here, you can see that settlers might control or have domain over a bit of what is now Tennessee, but that the majority of the land is still under Indigenous occupation and under Indigenous control, belongs to Indigenous people. And I just think that this is, again, like an incredibly important idea for us to be thinking about, that we have these boundaries and these lines that we've imposed on space, but that what's on paper is not always what's happening in practice. And so I do want to talk a bit about what the lives of Cherokee women would have been like. Authority among the Cherokee was organized locally. A Cherokee claim lineal and matrilineal kinship. It means that lineage is traced and property is passed down through the mother's line. And so men and women would get married in the Cherokee. It would usually be men from other clans. but the children did belong to the woman and to the woman's family. And so uncles were the prominent men in these children's lives, not their fathers. In fact, the children didn't really belong to their fathers. But if their fathers had sisters who had children, then that's who those fathers would have been related to and engaging with. The role as mother, as life giver, gave women a tremendous amount of authority, not less, as we are often, seeing in European cultures. It's sort of built into their cosmos and into their stories and into their religion. Women were life givers, and they were often associated with crops and with corn and with farming. And then we do see this replicated in Cherokee society. Women were often the people who participated in agriculture. They were the ones who farmed. They were the ones who were responsible for growing crops, for storing crops, the things that sort of kept tribes in touch with the earth. Cherokee women enjoyed a tremendous amount of personal upbringing, especially in comparison to European women. They experienced a significant amount of sexual freedom at this time. Men and women were allowed to engage in sexual activity. They were often would get married, and then after a period of time, should people choose to get divorced, they just would. I mean, I'm not to say that people didn't have hurt feelings sometimes, but there wasn't the scandal or sort of the shame or the big deal that we associate or that we have come to associate with that today. Again, women, they worked, right? They were the farmers, the producers, the food harvesters. All of these roles made women incredibly valuable to Cherokee society. And again, because this is a matrilineal system, women owned the houses, they owned their farmland, they, essentially owned or were responsible for their family households. And women influenced council meetings, which were open to everyone. They decided when groups went to war. They were able to decide when to go and capture people. They tortured captives. They decide when to free captives. Cherokee women engaged in diplomacy directly. We have a number of letters written by Cherokee women to various officials. Did not shy away from thinking it was their absolute right to go talk to the person in charge about what was going on in their, territory. And so women were present at the majority of council meetings and political engagements. There was no time, at least that we can tell, where women were not directly responsible and engaging with the people who made decisions, or were actually among the people who made decisions for their tribes and for their families. And in fact, we often see Cherokee women were also war women, right? They also went into battle. And so while Cherokee society certainly had a separation of roles, men and women occupied different spheres and had different ceremonies. Those differences and being separated did not make one less equal to the other. In fact, balance, right, in these gender roles is incredibly important to Cherokee society. Okay. I'm going to stick on this picture. I didn't have a good picture for the Chickasaw. I'm always a little anxious, to be honest, about using pictures, especially historical pictures, because one of the things about is that, we don't want Native Americans to constantly be relegated to the past when we're talking about them. That's a little hard for me because I'm a historian and I'm also talking about the past. And so I have tried to incorporate more artwork into my presentations lately instead, but I couldn't find something that I felt was particularly representative of the Chickasaw Nation in the time that I was looking for it. So pardon my cat, who also continues to come up here. So Chickasaw women engaged in many of the same practices. And I would say that when you listen to Chickasaw oral histories and listen to Chickasaw women speak, balance is emphasized constantly, even more so than what we see in Cherokee documents. And so maintaining a balance between men's roles and women's roles, and between what men contribute to society and what women contribute to society, was incredibly important. And again, men did tend to be warriors or hunters or defenders of their tribes and their homesteads, but women were the keeper of the stories and the keeper of their homes. And this idea about being the keeper of stories is going to come to matter in my next chat. Women were primarily agriculturalists, again, in the Chickasaw Nation. In war, they were communicators and strategists, but they would go into battle if they chose. And again, this matrilineal society meant that property transferred the hands of women, right? Women owned the houses, they owned the household, they owned the children, which also meant when European men came or European diplomats came, and then U.S. diplomats came and they wanted to engage with Chickasaw women and try to negotiate the sale of individual homesteads, they were often having to give their money to women if they wanted to engage in that kind of a transaction, which, you know, for many European men was not comfortable. And so I want to talk a little like what happens and why we see a shift, because certainly after state and then after the United States starts sort of encroaching on Cherokee and Chickasaw land and the land of the other peoples that I haven't mentioned here tonight. Again, just to sort of prevent myself from also overgeneralizing the time that we have. One of the ways that we sort of see gender roles shifting in response to European and US presence is with regards to farming. Of course, you know, among men in European society and then US society, farming is traditionally a man's job. And in these indigenous societies that we've looked at, farming was traditionally a woman's job. And as the Chickasaw and the Cherokee were sort of forced to assimilate and forced to adopt some of the European practices in response to that political pressure and political tension, farming shifts, right, from being part of a woman's domain into a man's domain. And so both parties really had to change and reconfigure their understandings of masculinity and femininity under these new gender norms. A lot of Chickasaw men circumvented this process by participating in enslaved labor. And so rather than, you know, doing the gendered labor themselves, the labor that had been previously gendered female themselves, they would instead delegate that labor to their enslaved people. And so in some ways, they sort of maintained a bit more of their original gendered division of labor. Ranching and husbandry was more attractive to them than agriculture, and had a tendency to participate in that instead. Women, to retain their connection to the land, even though they were not always farming now, started honing alternate forms of production like weaving. And even so, though, even with these shifts in farming away from being the women's domain and into the men's domain in response to assimilation concerns, women retained their family leadership roles and their family property roles. So these societies remained matrilineal, even while they are sort of facing pressures to change their gendered roles. But of course, we know that the United States was kind of a relentless force, right, on the East, just pushing and pushing West. And in a desire to be recognized as civilized and perhaps spared the worst of genocide and ethnic cleansing, although, you know, we can also talk about that at some point, whether or not they were actually spared the worst. They certainly do exist still, and that is significant and that matters. The Chickasaw and the Cherokee adopted, at least formally, many of their colonizers' characteristics. Christianity encouraged certain types of gender roles, almost always placing men in the most authoritative and prominent positions within the household. And the Cherokee Constitution politically disfranchised women, like in a formal sense. They said no more women coming to these council sessions. And there's something to be said about sort of being forced to bend to the gendered mores of a country that is trying to colonize you and trying to not only, you know, disfranchise you and take away your land, but to delegitimize you. You know, part of what Indigenous peoples are facing here and in other places is being constantly told by the United States that they're not like treaty worthy, that they don't have status as sovereign nations. And so often I think what we see are Indigenous populations who are sort of picking up some of the things that they believe will force the United States to recognize them as equals. But of course, they might be picking some of that up, but they're often changing it to suit their purposes. They're not picking it up wholesale. And we do see often that they might be picking it up in a formal sense or in a legal sense, but the way things are happening in practice is very different. All right, and so the Cherokee also end up centralizing power, you know, in response to these encroaching pressures. And that centralization of power in the hands of like a handful of usually elite Cherokee people decentralizes, that local familial authority. And it was that local familial authority and those smaller kinship networks that women were the head of that had given women their prominence in these discussions. And so, as these nations are trying to emulate the United States, and as the United States is encroaching on this region and what is now known as Tennessee, we see women sort of losing the political authority and political power that they had. Native women's lives and experiences are coming to mirror more closely Europeans' women's lives and experience. All that to say, that even though that's how things look on paper and formally, that isn't always how they play out in reality, right? Which I just said. Not have to be codified to be real. So women did, and of course do maintain right now, the front lines of political engagement, activism, and cultural preservation and promotion in Native American communities. So often if European and then American, if white men did not want to engage politically with Native women, the way Native women would have come to expect to be engaged with, because it went against European understandings or conceptions of, appropriate gender roles. It would not have been okay, for European men to go gallivanting around with Native women. I mean, they did, but again, we're talking sort of about formally versus what people are actually doing. And so Native men took on these roles that maybe before would have been women's roles, not just with the farming, right? But they also took on roles that European men better recognized as masculine. And that includes increasing roles with trade, with negotiation, and with diplomacy. And as a result, with men doing more of this engagement with colonizers, they would often dress differently, they would learn English. And with women being less likely to engage in those transactions and negotiations, they were less likely to sort of alter their form of dress when they could choose. Forced assimilation is a real thing that, again, we can also talk about. And they were less likely to lose their language immediately. And so it made them more likely to retain culture, traditions, and to be less assimilated. And because women were already responsible for their families and for their households and for their family education, women also become responsible for their culture and for their peoples more broadly. And so we sort of see this transition from maybe they're not so politically directly responsible for representing their families, but they do become the people who retain culture in a way that perhaps without women and without this shift in political responsibilities, they might not have been able to. So, they're responsible for the upbringing of children, and so they share this culture with their children. And we see, Indigenous culture continuing to live on through women transmitting it to their male and female children. And sometimes it had to take different forms because sometimes being Chickasaw, Cherokee, or any kind of Native American was dangerous. And so we see sort of a transformation too of culture in response to colonialism. And not always in response to colonialism, as in these cultures are becoming more like palatable to white people, or assimilation changes the stories. Often these stories are changing deliberately and intentionally because people have to hide in plain sight. Or people want to transmit significant things about their culture, but perhaps, their children are going to be punished for using Indigenous language, or they're going to be punished for telling Indigenous stories. And I'm not just saying like perhaps they would be. We do know that Indigenous children were taken from their families, put in residential schools, and punished for those things. And so I want to sort of leave this idea about it being a little bit dangerous to be Native into my next discussion. So, because in many ways, as I was saying, it is still dangerous to be Native. But this is also a talk about suffrage. So I'm going to dial it back a minute, talk a little bit about suffrage, and then I kind of want to talk about the state of Native American women and politics today. So, we had the 15th Amendment before the 19th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment said you couldn't discriminate on the basis of race. And then the 19th Amendment comes along and says no discrimination on the basis of sex. But in 1876, Native Americans are not actually citizens, and therefore they can't vote. They can't vote at all. It doesn't matter if they've assimilated by force or not, right? It doesn't matter if they still participate with their sovereign tribes or not. They just can't vote. And that changes in 1924. And so with the Snyder Act, citizenship extends to Native peoples if they give up their tribal affiliation. But even with those acts and even with those, constitutional amendments, we know that there are plenty of other ways to inhibit people and prevent them from voting, most of which were not dealt with until the 1960s, whether that's taxes, literacy, language. And for Native people, a lot of these issues continue today. Currently there's a requirement that you must have a residential address, and residential addresses are not available to many people who live on Native American reservations. And in the last presidential election, that invalidated a number of Indigenous people from being able to participate in the election and to be able to exercise their right to vote. And so there is still a tremendous amount of work to do, for voting in general, but also for sort of supporting the rights of Indigenous people. And women do tend to be at the front of this work, not only in Tennessee, but across North America. And earlier I spoke about erasure, and I want to talk about this a little bit, right? Because we sort of go through extremes with the issue of Native American women in this country. They exercise a tremendous amount of political power prior to colonization, but it has been very hard to sort of regain full political participation in the wake of colonization. Native Americans have been erased from history through a variety of ways. We participate in their erasure when we don't acknowledge them, when we allow them to continue to be mascots, when we don't listen to people who complain about, Thanksgiving pageants being children dressed up in red face and dressing up as slave traders. But Native women are literally vanishing as well. I don't know if you're all familiar with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, but over 500 Native women in this country have gone missing or have been murdered. And so there's recently been an inquiry opened into it, but it's a significant problem. Native Americans might make up about 2% of the US population, but they experience a disproportionate amount of discrimination, even compared to other marginalized groups. Indigenous youth experience alcohol and drug abuse and suicide at higher rates. And the historical sort of policies of kill the Indian to save the man have ramifications on Indigenous people today. 1 in 3 Native American women assaulted or raped, which is more than twice the national average. 46% of women report being raped, beaten, or abused by a partner, and 80% of victims identify their partners as non-Native. Native American women are also 10 times more likely to be murdered than any other women in the United States. They experience police brutality at higher rates than any other group and receive less media attention. And so I wanted to share this, not to sort of shift our triumphant narrative into a trauma narrative, because I also don't like that. In addition to constantly rendering Native peoples to the past, one of the things we have to be mindful of too when we talk about Native Americans is also not telling only trauma-centered narratives. But I think it's incredibly important for us to think about here is that we're sort of, imagining this political Native people had prior to colonization, and then what is the cost of colonization for Indigenous people, and how can we restore, our Native citizens and our Native brothers and sisters back to being like full citizens who do not have to worry about going or being murdered. I want to talk about this because I think we have to acknowledge that while it is also women on the front lines of this political work most often, Native people are incredibly vulnerable, often compared to other peoples, and Native women in particular are incredibly vulnerable. And to be honest, I also think that makes them incredibly brave for the work that they're doing. And what might be a bit of a shameless plug, I've been very fortunate to work with a Native woman here, Zianya Hawk Cruz, to form an organization called Native Rights, which is Natives Reclaiming Our Indigenous Truths, Education and Sovereignty. And one of the things that we're trying to do in the Mid-South that we are, this is not actually a shameless plug, it's a shameless ask for help, that we are really committed to sort of Indigenous people together and to talk about these issues here in Tennessee and across the Mid-South. And so, I've been really fortunate in my time at the university and through these talks to meet a number of Indigenous people. And again, not a Native American myself. I am a Native Hawaiian. Native Rights is about decolonization more broadly and is supposed to be open and is open to anybody who does experience colonization. And so that does include people from Native Hawaii. But one of the things that our organization is trying to do is to think about the relationship between suffrage and Indigenous people more broadly, and to think about how we can better advocate for women in the state of Tennessee. How do we sort of go back and not necessarily restore, but how do we make sure that being Indigenous in Tennessee does not hinder Native women, and rather that it helps Native women? I think, okay, so I'm going to actually minimize this. I have more to say, but I'm going to stop the PowerPoint. Okay. All of this is not to, again, diminish the significance of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment is incredibly, incredibly important. You know, anything that removes barriers to voting, anything that makes discrimination illegal is going to help everybody, especially considering the way the United States sort of hops, skips, and jumps across the continent and incorporates people into it, whether or not they wanted to be there. Voting matters in a democracy, and on this continent, before the United States came into being, people were able to have a direct voice in their government, and women in particular were able to do that. And so we have a century in what is now Tennessee, when the women who lived here, whether they were here already or whether they were brought here with US Americans as colonizers or settlers or brought here by force, did not have that say. But as we can see, or as I hope at least we've started to think about, that century was an anomaly compared to the lives women led here prior to the 19th century. And then, of course, thanks to the 19th Amendment, compared to the subsequent lives that we were able to live here in the 20th and now the 21st century. In a way, women have regained their prominent, critical, and traditional role in decision-making for their families, their communities, and societies, and often at great cost. Women's voices have always been, and therefore will continue to be, a pillar of our democracy in the United States. Thank you. Oops. And I would love to take any questions if people have them.
Sorry, a second. Thank you so much for that, Amanda. That was amazing. When there's some concepts that are, you know, listening to them, you're like, of course, that is obvious. But just piecing them together within the realms of, you know, past, it helps. That's what historians do, right? You kind of piece together those pieces in the past. So that was wonderful. Especially the part about the women essentially creating or inheriting the role of the culture and sharing the culture. Is that something or a concept that still exists today within Native communities?
So often you will sort of, and just to be clear, I was afraid when I say things about Native women that I am also not doing Native men their due justice. And so Native men, of course, do a tremendous amount of political engagement and frontline work, and are also people who have preserved Indigenous culture. But by and large, it is still Indigenous women who are considered sort of the aunties and the people who retain culture, and then the people who share the stories, right? And then help us enforce it with our younger generations. In part, that is related to, you know, the childbearing aspect. But in a lot of ways, this is sort of like, because women were not sheltered from colonialism, colonialism touches every aspect, right, of Indigenous lives in many ways. But women were able to sort of hold that part of their private life back. This is where being part of the private sphere, or what Europeans, you know, sort of shove women into the private sphere, really does come to have some benefits. And yeah, being able to sort of retain that culture and being the people who then perpetuate that culture and help promote that culture is a role that I think we see with more Indigenous women now than we did before. So.
All right, we have a question, and if anyone has any questions, please send them in. Can you speak more on the shift from matrilineal political interaction to a more patriarchal centered participation? You see the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Culture and family life.
Mhm.
So, yes, I can speak to that. Just I'm gathering my thoughts quickly. So we do see, with the loss of sort of women as direct political or like advocates, right, to the government. And we do see the role of men and men within the family and men within the home becoming, affected by that. So we see women sort of downshifting a bit, even as their role within the private sphere becomes more concentrated. And we do see men upshifting a bit with that. I would say that Christianity plays, though, a significant role in that. That we see a number of Indigenous people becoming more Christian or adopting Christianity in general. Means that we see a shift in family life away from sort of mothers being the dominant family. What would you call that? Parental unit. I mean, they're both parental units, but we do see fathers sort of, even if they aren't participating in a more hands-on way, we do see fathers and what fathers say and what fathers think having more significance and a more sort of, they are having more say in the lives of their children and in their upbringing. And this isn't the same as families participating 50-50 in a child's upbringing, right? Instead, what we're seeing is that men are often able to have a large child's upbringing without actually doing 50% of the work still. But that's a shift too that we're seeing, that we're moving away from in the 21st century as well, not just in the broader US context, but within Native societies and Native cultures, at least as far as I can tell. The majority of Indigenous men that I do know and interact with are incredibly hands-on fathers. My cat is just destroying everything during this talk, I swear to God. I would say that other aspects that were affected, we see as power is centralized at a higher level instead of being distributed across clans and across family units. We do see that most of those council members and most of the people making decisions do tend to become men. And often that is not only in response to sort of the the centralization of that power structure, but because Europeans and then Americans do prefer to interact in diplomacy with men. And so just by virtue of this is how hegemony works, right? It sort of spreads out into everything. Just by virtue of who Europeans and Americans will speak to, US Americans. I'm trying to get out of the habit of calling all people in North American. And United Statesians is not quite rolling off my tongue yet. So if I correct myself often, I promise it's just a verbal habit I'm trying to break. And so we do see power that used to be decentralized, right? Sort of not only more centralized with men, but that carrying back into how things are done in family units and among, smaller community systems. And so women, again, lose a lot of their formal ability to negotiate and to advocate, but they don't usually, we don't see them losing it, at least at the household level too. This is hard though for me to really put my finger on after this though, because it really depends on tribes and people. And I'm overgeneralizing majorly when I say that. I'm sure that there are lots of examples of it not going that way, and certainly lots of examples of sort of pushback too. So okay, so what are some things being done today in order for Native women to regain more political autonomy? Well, I will say that at the risk of sounding flip, because I do not mean to sound flip at all. I mean, one of the things that Native women are trying to do mostly is stay alive. We live in a country that disproportionately hunts and targets Indigenous women, whether that is formally through a state-sponsored system, or whether that is informally through just individual acts of violence. And so first and foremost, Native women are trying to stay alive. They are trying to retain their language. Language support and education support has been really critical for a lot of Indigenous women. I would also say that Indigenous peoples are, in my experience, they're sort of split on the vote, whether or not, being really aggressive with voting in political politics or US political politics is that important to political autonomy. I would say a number of people think that yes, and we saw the Indigenous vote shift how Arizona went, right? Whether or not you saw the maps, the majority of votes, new Indigenous votes, 78,000 votes, were all sort of for one candidate, and it changed how Arizona went. I know people want to say it's because everybody was mad about John McCain, but I really think it's because of Native people. But a number of Indigenous people think that agreeing to participate in U.S. politics is like acknowledging U.S. politics are prominent and are the determiner of Indigenous sovereignty. And so a lot of people really don't think that a lot of Indigenous people don't believe that they should be participating in the vote. They usually don't believe that other Indigenous people shouldn't be participating in the vote. They just think that engaging in U.S. politics is like saying the United States has a right to be there and has a right to rule. I will say, too, that educational sovereignty is something, right? The ability to determine the way Indigenous peoples are presented in histories that are taught in this country. I will say decolonizing a lot of that education has been something that we were thinking about. And I know we often think that maybe educational stuff isn't related to political autonomy, but what people learn about Native peoples and how they learn about them absolutely informs then what they go off and do about Indigenous policy or the arguments that Native people have. And then food sovereignty is incredibly important. And it'd be terrible if I did not also mention that the land back movement is also gaining some prominence. If you're not familiar with that, a lot of Native people are just saying, give us our land back, give land back to Indigenous people or back to Indigenous tribes and let the people that the land belongs to, Indigenous people are not looking to kick off all of the colonizers, but let people have sort of domain over that land again, and let Indigenous people have a place and a space where they can participate in their culture and they can practice their own forms of politics. Treat their governments like they are sovereign governments, not dependent sovereigns. Native governments in the United States are often still considered dependent sovereigns, which means that even though they don't have a state-to-state relationship with individual states, they still have a relationship with the government. But there are lots with the federal government. But there are lots of loopholes that allow people to go on to reservations and onto Indigenous land and circumvent tribal law. Tribes aren't at will to sort of practice their own forms of government and their own legal jurisdictions the way other sovereign nations would be. And so I would say that's a lot of answer for that question, and I'm really sorry about that. But those are some of the ways I think would be important for Indigenous peoples to practice or to regain that political autonomy that they had before.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for your thoughts and for your presentation. Honestly, it's wonderful to hear you speak. And this is admittedly a topic I didn't focus a lot on in my studies, just Native American history in general. It's only something recently that I've been getting into to, better understand and speak to the issues facing Native Americans today. So learning as much as I can is always helpful. And I'm sure a lot of people are doing what they can to learn as well. So hopefully this is an asset to those people. Anyway, again, thank you for joining us.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I meant to pop these in the link when we first started. Oops, I don't know why there's so much space between them. That's just a link to the map I used at the beginning that I thought was really useful for beginning to reimagine what our space looks like. Link to Native rights, because if you have ideas or suggestions, or if you want to get involved, we are absolutely looking to sort of expand what it means to be Native here in the Mid-South. And then just the territorial acknowledgement I read, I like to link to that as well. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And to wrap up, we do have one more Native American Heritage Month program next Tuesday at 6 p.m. It is called Saving Native Languages, the History of the Decline and Preservation of Native Languages, which is actually something you hit on briefly on the role of women in preserving that language that slowly began to get lost. So, and they're working on preserving. So wonderful. So make sure to check in next week. And we are recording this. So if you want to watch it again, it'll be on our YouTube. But yeah, we will see you next week if you like. And you have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.